And a glorious good evening to each and every one of you. I'm going to be picking up with chapter 5 of Black AF History, the unwhitewashed story of America. But as I have been doing and will continue to do, start off by helping you to remember that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, because that is the only thing that ever has. So with that, I'm going to pick up chapter 5. Get the book. Because, as I told you when I first started reading, there are questions that you need to ponder at the end of every chapter, and I'm not reading those. I'm just reading the meat and potatoes, because there are a lot of names that your kid, when asked to do that Black History Month report, can look up, research, and get educated, educate the whole family about it. So with that, chapter 5, Drapetomaniacs. Get free or die trying. Before preachers, life coaches, and self-help gurus proclaimed they could cure crack smoking, depression, and infidelity with vision boards, self-affirmations, and prayer cards, Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright mesmerized America with a pseudoscientific breakthrough that would remain unmatched until the invention of the shake weight. Although he was previously best known for his staunch opposition to the wild idea that microscopic ghosts called germs caused disease in 1851, Cartwright would become most renowned for presenting a paper before the Medical Association of Louisiana proposing an explosive new mental illness called drapetomania, or the disease causing slaves to run away. In it, he wrote, the cause in the most of cases that induces the Negro to run away from service is as much a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation, and much more curable as a general rule. With the advantages of proper medical advice strictly followed, this troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented, although the slaves be located on the borders of a free state within a stone's throw of the abolitionists. Cartwright's racist pseudo-psychology illustrates another delusion of whiteness, namely the continued justification of oppression, state-sanctioned rape, murder, and unending torture by portraying black people's insatiable inclination toward freedom as a sickness or a criminal impulse. For everyone else, the irrepressible compulsion for liberty is viewed as a symptom of a craven, barbaric psychopathy. This nation's history is pockmarked with examples of the idea that freedom is only for white people. Although most Enlightenment era thinkers agreed that freedom is the natural state of man, they somehow carved out an exception for their belligerent Negroes because, in their white minds, property rights were as important as individual freedom. The race-based forced labor system that built America into an economic power could only exist through violence and the threat of violence. In places like South Carolina, where the captives outnumbered the free, this state-sanctioned institution of racial dehumanization required constant enforcement. But every speck of evidence reveals that resistance, both conscious and subconscious, was interwoven into the fabric of life as an enslaved person. Through acts large and small, organized and individual, the search for liberty was a way of life for Africans in America. It wasn't drapetomania, but a persistent and unyielding belief in their personhood that drove the enslaved Africans to seek out freedom. Under Cartwright's asinine hypothesis, this imaginary illness manifested itself in many ways. Some sufferers ran away to freedom, while others were mad enough to physically resist oppression. The most unhinged drapetomaniacs did the unthinkable. They tried to eliminate the source of their oppression. But according to this medical diagnosis, the contagion's victims shared a common goal: to get free or to die trying. It was sometimes impossible to tell when an enslaved person was struck with freedom fever. While the most popular stories of resistance involve coordinated violent events, the most common form of resistance took place in small ways and on a daily basis. All across America, Africans coerced into bondage used understated and not so subtle methods to counteract the brutality of slavery. Some undermined their evil overlords' financial goals by reducing productivity, sabotaging their work equipment, and planning labor strikes. Others played sick or worked in a slow, deliberate manner. When a generally dependable servant stopped taking pride in their work, drapetomania was a potential cause. Of course, enslavers searched for cures for this malady. The city of Charleston, South Carolina, developed an entire, quote, corrections, end quote, industry dedicated to punishing and reforming rebellious human property. Slave owners could send insolent slaves to the sugar house, an old sugar factory where city workers were paid to whip and re-educate the troublemakers and malingers. The first execution in the Massachusetts colony took place in 1681 when Maria, a Negro servant to Joshua Lambie of Roxbury, set her master's house on fire, as well as a neighbor's. According to the Massachusetts Bay Colony's court records, Maria wittingly, willingly, and feloniously set on fire the dwelling house of Thomas Swan, and presently went and crept into a hole at the back door of the master's land's house and set it on fire also. Maybe Maria was a cold-blooded murderer. Perhaps the desire to be a full, independent human being had driven her into the state of pyromania. In any case, there was only one antidote for Maria's delirium. The compassionate people of Massachusetts had to burn her alive at the stake. They had no choice. In a capitalist racket based on the theft of labor, intellect, and black bodies, it may seem logical that Africans would resort to stealing things from the people who stole them as well. But according to the rules of drapetomania, these people had a medical disorder that turned them into thieves. One day, a group of us were working in the field. Cecilia Simmons Green recalls of her time on the Grimball plantation on James Island in South Carolina. We heard Mr. Henson talking to another white man. He was telling him, "You think them niggas stupid, but they have plenty of sense. I think some of them been going into my fields at night, stealing my vegetables and selling them in the market." We would hold our heads down and laugh because we knew who was thieving the vegetables. Apparently, in South Carolina, the person who sows, waters, weeds, and harvests a plant can somehow steal it from the people who did absolutely nothing to create it. Since enslaved people were governed by property laws, running away to freedom was legally considered an act of theft, despite the ironic fact that the whole slave-making industry was based on abduction. Sometimes these drapetomaniac slaves absconded to British-controlled Canada, other free states, or wherever the Underground Railroad led them. But these weren't the only places to run. Some of the most popular escape destinations in America for the enslaved were just anywhere away from white people. Sally Smith, a woman enslaved on a Louisiana plantation, says she stayed in the woods half of the time of her enslavement depending on the kindness of the other enslaved people in the area. Assuming her brother knew her whereabouts, Sally's former captor tortured her brother until he too bolted from the plantation and joined her in the woods. Unfortunately, there were no peer-reviewed studies to investigate whether these recurring bouts of drapetomania were genetic. The South was surprisingly also a viable option for some slaves who were infected with this ailment. There, entire communities were built that are still being discovered today, including Basse des Fleurs, a vast area between the mouth of the Mississippi and New Orleans. That was controlled by runaways for most of the 1770s. During the colonial period, the all-black town of Fort Mose in the Spanish-held Florida Territory was a popular destination for those who wanted a permanent vacation from slavery. Spain had abolished slavery in that territory, and after the War of 1812, a fully armed British Negro fort in Florida became the center of the black resistance against the Institute of Slavery, forming its own army. The British Corps of Colonial Marines was made up of free blacks and fugitive slaves who fought alongside Native Americans to protect the kind runaways who quarantined themselves to protect others from their contagious virus. Perhaps the most remarkable of these oases of freedom was the Great Dismal Swamp, a 1,000,000-acre area that covered southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. Historians still don't quite know how many escaped Africans built communities and lived free in the Great Dismal Swamp, but new research suggests that thousands may have lived there. Historians usually refer to these collective groups of unownable Africans as Maroons, but the nomenclature varied by region. In Alabama and Georgia, they were called people who lived in the woods, but perhaps the most telling moniker for the self-emancipated Africans came from Virginia and Maryland in the Great Dismal Swampland. Nicknamed the Outlands, the region was too treacherous to travel through by horse or canoe. Virginians ultimately reappropriated an adjective to describe unconquerable residents of the unconquered lands, calling these freedom-inclined boys in the hood outlandish. From colonial times on, many of these Maroons kept themselves alive through the generosity of enslaved Africans on plantations, as well as by hunting, fishing, and raising their own crops. Some engaged in small-scale banditry and theft, but for the most part, they didn't bother white people, so white people left them alone. Because tens of thousands of these outlandish Africans had fought against the Patriots in the Revolution, many had weapons, military training, and knowledge of how plantations worked. They also had no intention of working from sun up to sundown without a pay stub. One of the longest lasting of these communities flanked both sides of the Savannah River in the area that separates Georgia from South Carolina. Maroons had lived there since the 1770s, but in 1786, the grand jury of Chatham County, Georgia, demanded that the local militia do something about the large gangs of runaway Negroes. Early on the morning of October 11, 1786, militiamen attacked the settlement. 4 white soldiers were wounded and 4 Maroons were killed in the skirmish before the militia found themselves low on ammunition and retreated. Determined to return these free souls to the bondage on behalf of the land of the free, the militia gathered a few more white men and then attacked again at sunset. But the Maroons were waiting and overwhelmed the militia, forcing them to back that ass up again. But you know, these fools couldn't let the word out that they had been beaten by a group of ragtag Negroes. Even a whiff of self-determination and resistance threatened the entire fabric of the slave-based society. The Maroon hunters returned the next morning, hoping the can of whoop ass opened by the former slaves had been depleted, unaware that the Maroon Flight Club had four rules. Number one, do not talk do not talk about Maroon Club. Number two, do not talk about Maroon Club. Number three, only fight when it's absolutely necessary. And number four, if white people keep showing up, there is no more Maroon Club. When the white boys returned, the Maroon settlement was empty. The militia destroyed the small encampment, including the homes, the farms, the barns, 15 boats, and 3,400 pounds of rice. But still, the Maroons survived, building another encampment. The next spring, a South Carolina militia overran and destroyed another community on the other side of the Savannah River. Within 6 months, the Maroons had built another community. The new location had 21 homes protected by a 4-foot wall. Thanks to the rules of the Maroon Fight Club, Maroonage could continue. While many escaped slaves took to communities like these, some, like Harriet Jacobs, survived as a Maroon wholly without community. Harriet Jacobs was born a slave in 1813. On a legal technicality, according to the ancient Virginian principle of partus sequitur ventre, a child born to a slave was also a slave. Harriet's grandmother, Molly, had been freed by her owner, but was later kidnapped and re-enslaved. Because of this, Harriet's mother was doomed for a life of slavery, as were Harriet and her brother John. Harriet and her brother taught themselves how to read and vowed to escape after they were sold at auction and separated from their mother and grandmother. Harriet's grandmother was eventually freed again and allowed to live in a house on the plantation where Harriet and John were also living as slaves. When she was 15, Harriet's master began sexually harassing her. Hoping for protection, she began a relationship with Samuel Sawyer, a lawyer who would later become a U.S. congressman and father Harriet's 2 children. Harriet's master was so mad about the relationship that he sold Harriet to his brother, but Harriet eventually escaped and began living as a Maroon. Meanwhile, Harriet's harassing master offered her children along with her brother at a discount to a slave trader, but only after the slave trader promised to separate them and sell them individually. The slave trader promised, but instead sold the entire family to Sawyer, the slave-raping congressman, who had promised Harriet that he'd free their kids and her brother. He, of course, never did. Sawyer did, however, send the kids to live with their great-grandmother, Molly, who was still living on the plantation. This at least gave Harriet some relief, because she had the opportunity to watch her children grow up. And if you're wondering how she did that if she was a runaway, well, Harriet was living right underneath her former master's nose. During the day, she would hide in a nearby swamp. At night, she hid out in Molly's attic, never revealing her presence to her kids. The attic had no light, and at its highest point was 3 feet tall. Harriet managed to drill a hole in the cramped crawl space so she could read the Bible and watch her children. She lived that way for 7 years. Eventually, she escaped to New York, where she was reunited with her children and her brother, who had been sent north by Sawyer, but still essentially lived as slaves. Because of the fugitive slave laws, the evil enslaver still technically owned Harriet. Ever so often, he would find out where Harriet lived, and she would have to go into hiding again. It wasn't until 1852, when Harriet was 39 years old, that abolitionist Cornelia Grinnell Willis, for whom Harriet worked as a nanny, would purchase Harriet's freedom for $300. The rapist congressman, who still owned Harriet's children and brother, finally sent them to free states to live with Harriet. She spent the next 5 years writing the story of her life, but no one would publish it. In January 1861, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was finally released, and Harriet became an abolitionist icon. Some manifestations of the disease were so acute that they sparked unbelievable stories, like the Gullah Geechee folktale of the Igbo people who can fly. Ain't you heard about them? Well, at that time, Mr. Blue, he was the overseer, and Mr. Blue, he go down one mountain with a long whip for tug whip them good. Anyway, he whipped them good, and they gets together and stick the hoe in the field, and then rise up in the sky and turn herself into buzzards and flew right back to Africa. In May 1803, a shipload of 75 captive Igbo people were purchased for $100 each to grow rice on forced labor plantations on St. Simons Island in Georgia. Apparently, the ship was infested with Cartwright's disease. That was cryptomania. Because the shackled passengers screamed all the way to America. When the captain would send members of the crew down into the belly of the ship to quiet them, the crew members were terrified to realize that the captives weren't just screaming. They were saying one chant over and over in unison. O Ramiri, O Mambala, Buanya Bia. When the ship got close to the shore, the chants grew louder. O Ramiri, O Mambala, Buanyi Bia. They prayed in unison. Then somehow they broke the chains and threw the entire crew overboard. Led by a captured chieftain, the Africans then walked calmly into the sea, chanting, O Ramiri, O Mambala, Buanyi Bia, drowning themselves rather than be slaves. Some say the number was 75. Other sources put the number at 13. One contemporaneous account described it as a terrible loss of the plantation's owner's investment. Others described the Igbo rebellion as a mass suicide. Whatever the case, witnesses watched while shackled slaves calmly walked into the Dunbar Creek on St. Simons Island in Glenn County, Georgia, and drowned themselves, chanting, "The water spirit brought us here. The water spirit will take us home." They were free. One of the worst incidents of Draketomania happened on January 28, 1856, when Margaret Gardner, her husband, their 4 children, and 11 of their fellow enslaved freedom seekers stole their master's horse, his sleigh, and gun, and absconded from their Boone County, Kentucky plantation owner, Archibald Gaines. The family crossed the frozen Ohio River and split up. The other escapees eventually made it to freedom by way of the Underground Railroad, while the Gardners hid out at the house of their uncle Elijah Kite, a free black man. Fugitive slave catchers eventually discovered the family's location and surrounded Uncle Kite's house, hoping to return them to their owner. 22-year-old Margaret knew they were done for. Described as a mulatto who was always cross-tempered, Margaret was likely the product of a slave master raping her mother. Historians say at least 2 of her children had been conceived from the same rampant slave master's sexual assaults. Knowing the horrors that would undoubtedly befall her daughters, rather than see them suffer the same fate, Margaret grabbed a butcher knife and slit her 2-year-old daughter's throat. To sacrifice the fruit born of one's own womb as a gift of liberty is a decision that only the most desperate freedom seeker can know. Gardner's story served as the basis for Toni Morrison's award-winning novel, Beloved. The insatiable desire to get free by any means necessary included the option of death. Of course, give me liberty or give me death sounded perfectly rational when it comes from the lips of a white person. But logic, common sense, and the narcissistic delusion of whiteness dictates that black people who would rather die than be enslaved must be mentally ill. Ask Dr. Cartwright. That's just science. But the most famous and most belligerent of these drapetomaniacs terrified white people in the coastal region of South Carolina for years, while providing an unfettered example of resistance to the black folks in that region. The undisputed king of the Maroon Bandits, escapees, and saboteurs was a man they called Forrest Joe. Couldn't nobody own Forrest Joe. Very little is known about Forrest because he escaped from the Carroll plantation in South Carolina's Richland district, but by the spring of 1821, the celebrated bandit Joe was becoming notorious for his brazen, charismatic leadership and his ability to vanish into thin air. Chronically ill with stage 5 drapetomania, he was unapologetic about infecting enslaved people with his affliction. If Angela Davis had a baby with T'Challa and gave it up for adoption to be raised by Tupac, that baby would one day read about the first man to truly live the thug life and say, that Forrest Joe dude be wild. Joe was over 6 feet tall and light-skinned, with a scar on his cheek from when someone had bitten him during a fight, and calves that were pockmarked from gunshot pellets he suffered during his encounters with fugitive slave hunters. To say that he was an intimidating presence would be an understatement. Joe had a variety of tactics to help bolster the badass image. Unlike the clothes of most Maroons and enslaved Africans, Joe's weren't made of osnaburg, a coarse, often white fabric used for slave garments. He had found a way to dye or stain his clothing different shades of brown. This makeshift camouflage helped him blend into the background, but it wasn't the most incredible part of Forrest's gear. Joe had also fashioned himself an upper garment out of some material through which no balls could well pass, or so it was said. That's right, Joe, in 1821, had created a bulletproof vest. Joe ran with a tight gang of Maroons that included women and children. One of Joe's best homeboys was a man named Jack, who stole himself from his master and walked 200 miles to join Joe's crew. Joe's second best homie was also named Jack. Together, Joe, Jack, and the other Jack would form a clique that terrified white people more than critical race theory, absentee voting, and affirmative action combined. Like Free Ray Ricky Royce, Frankie Beverly, and the concept of rhythm, most people in the black community knew about Joe long before white people found out about it. An abundance of charisma, combined with his inability to give a damn about white people's laws, created an inflated myth that endeared him to his already enslaved brothers and sisters throughout Georgia and South Carolina. Accomplices would also carry out many of the late-night raids, but attribute them to Joe, Jack, and the rest of the Maroon gangsters on those plantations. This precursor to the no snitching rule enhanced Joe's reputation as a master bandit of mythic proportions who could single-handedly steal livestock, crops, and hundreds of pounds of lead to milk for ammunition. Late on the night of May 21st, 1821, Joe and the two Jacks were out killing cattle on George Ford's plantation. One of Ford's 49 enslaved Africans dry snitched on Joe. So Ford, one or two of his Negroes, and a white man, a carpenter employed by him, set out to stop Joe's raid. Joe and his merry band of thugs were ready and waiting. When George pulled up on his late model horse, Joe's gang ambushed George's crew. Walking Jack opened fire, shooting Ford in the head and the chest. With only one gun between them, George's team ran for cover while Joe and the others were able to escape in a canoe they had hidden at the mouth of the Santee River. But of course, there's always one guy who messes everything up. Ford's killer would have remained a mystery, but apparently Jack really liked oxtail. When he walked back to retrieve the cattle, one of Ford's men was hiding behind the dead ox and captured him. 2 weeks later, Jack was hanged, but not before confessing that Joe was the ringleader. To quell his constituents' concerns, Governor Thomas Bennett offered a bounty of $168.62 for Joe's head. A group of militiamen formed a formal Joe hunting committee and raised another $300 in reward money, instigating a manhunt that would last for years. Instead of admitting that Joe could outsmart them, militiamen reported that he knew some kind of magic, or that he had extra long legs that allowed him to cover distances very quickly. Some people believed he was impervious to bullets and could make himself invisible. The story of Joe's escapades spread, worrying white South Carolinians while further securing his status as a hero to the enslaved population. As the chase for Joe consumed the state, the elusive fugitive also helped free scores of enslaved Africans, enlarging South Carolina's maroon population. Captives who stayed on plantations would even help him out with inside information and intelligence. For many, ensuring Joe's survival was a form of resistance in and of itself. On the day of Jack's execution, Joe entered the Georgetown home of a free black couple and escaped after the woman was obliged to give Joe a considerable quantity of bacon and corn. Unfortunately for the authorities, the unharmed couple had no idea which way Joe went. On June 22nd, another South Carolinian managed to set a trap for Joe. After encountering Joe stealing his lead, a gentleman retreated but made 3 of his coloreds wait for the bandit near the riverbed, where he kept a canoe and a raft. He would never see the boat or the raft again, and only one of his coloreds returned. Another enslaved woman was in her master's home when Joe burst in and somehow found all of the owner's ammunition, guns, and powder. Some people thought it was pretty strange that she didn't scream or alert the neighbors to Joe's presence. Instead, she waited calmly, unharmed, until her now unarmed enslaver returned home. In 1822, 3 men reported that they had severely wounded Joe, but he had made a miraculous recovery that no one could understand. Maybe it was black magic. Perhaps Joe really was a witch, or a ghost. Whatever he was driving the white people crazy with fear and trepidation. To be fair, the rumors weren't just coming from anxious whites. In November, the Charleston City Gazette printed an account warning their readers that they had received reports of armed runaway Negroes who were robbing people outside of the city. Apparently, several Negroes were headed to town to buy supplies for their owners when they were stopped and robbed of their master's money and goods. After keeping the victims in custody till after night, the evil criminals who somehow still had the morals not to harm the people they were accosting, decided to let the servants go, even giving them prepared statements to take back to their enslavers. The black victims dutifully delivered these insulting and menacing messages to the masters of those whom they had robbed. I can hear him now. Some dude named Joe robbed us, took your money, made us hang out with him all day, and then he let us go. He told us to tell you not to come looking for him, or he'll do you like he did Ford. Also, he said you should give me a few days off, or he gonna kill you. Now, you know I love working in the field, but that's what he said, and he looked real mad, too. By 1823, Joe was a veritable superhero. Black people were looking out for him, feeling the aura of power around him, while others were joining him. When questioned by the militia, some enslaved Africans would say that they had spotted Joe just to throw them off the scent. Some embellished his status by perpetuating the myth that Joe was a voodoo priest who drank the blood of his victims. Joe had somehow managed to create an intelligence network and a disinformation machine. The white population was scared out of their minds, and for good reason. Sometimes Old Forest Joe outperformed even the wildest rumors. Joe was reportedly steaming mad that an enslaved driver had rescued a woman whom Joe was holding for ransom. Some people say she was Joe's mistress, and the two were running a scheme to extract money from the woman's master. By some people, I mean the woman. Because as soon as this woman was freed, she escaped again, went back to Joe's camp, and stayed with him until his last day. Regardless, you know Joe couldn't let some off-brand driver play him like that. It would ruin his street cred. So Joe vowed to kill the driver. Everyone begged him not to do it because the driver belonged to the former governor. But Joe wasn't known as a particularly cautious guy, and he would not be deterred. In August 1823, over 2 years after he killed George Ford, Forrest Joe walked onto the plantation of former South Carolina Governor James Burchell Richardson in broad daylight. In front of the enslaved people, the plantation overseer, and everyone on the plantation, Forrest pulled out a gun and shot the driver dead. And just for good measure, he turned and fired at the overseer. Of course, this just amplified Joe's legend. Many of the other enslaved people considered drivers to be accomplices to white enslavers. And while he had been best known for his midnight raids and eluding his hunters under the cover of darkness, to do this on a former governor's plantation meant there was no longer any further doubt that Joe was undeniably real. Of course, the moment Joe started shooting at white people in broad daylight was the day everything changed. Desperate, the Joe hunting militia decided to offer the rewards to certain Negroes to snitch on Joe with the promise of no stitches. The group even agreed to free any slave who helped them find Joe. For months, people kept quiet, until October, when an enslaved riverboat worker named Royal decided to take the money and lead a militia to Joe. After several days, the militia eventually found Joe near the Santee River, and a standoff ensued. Vowing he would never be taken alive, Joe was killed on the spot. After his death, the South Carolina militia raided Joe's camps and killed many of the Maroons, including a 3-year-old. For added measure, they cut off Joe's head and put it on a stake at the mouth of the river as a warning to vicious slaves. There's no record that Royal ever received his monetary reward or was even set free. for the South Carolina Joe chasing militia that killed Forrest Joe and swindled Royal would continue to hunt maroons and fugitive slaves and change the South forever. Scholars and media outlets routinely cite Boston as creating the nation's first municipal law enforcement agency in 1838, which is technically correct. However, over a decade prior, on October 2nd, 1823, the citizens of Pineville, South Carolina, had met in the town's library to devise a plan for apprehending or dispersing a gang of desperate runaways. The group immediately began collecting money from the town's citizens to solve its maroon problem. One of the number is a fellow called Forrest, or Joe, wrote the committee's secretary and treasurer, Thomas Gilliard. This party, sheltered by the difficulties of an approach to their camp and strengthened by firearms and other weapons of offense, have threatened the lives of many individuals. By daring acts of villainy, have disturbed the peace of this community and carry on unmolested a system of open violence and robbery. The good citizens of South Carolina had no idea that they were treating a disease that wouldn't be discovered for more than a quarter of a century. 28 years before a bunk physician discovered the disease causing slaves to run away, and 15 years before the General Court of Boston passed a law to organize its day patrol, the newly formed Standing Committee simultaneously came up with a cure for the diseased freedom thirsters and an official name for its Forrest Joe Apprehension Commission. The slave hunting squad's name would eventually serve as a prescription for drapetomaniacs like Joe, as well as define the relationship between black Americans, free or enslaved, and law enforcement agencies for years to come. They called themselves the Pineville Police Association. Now, to kill whites. The Multicultural Rebellion of 1811. This is a supplement to Chapter 5. While sugar farmer James Brown was purchasing a few items from the trading firm run by Stephen Henderson and William Kerner in the summer of 1806, he found an incredible bargain. For a mere $1,300, Brown purchased 15-year-old Kwaku and 21-year-old Kwamina, two healthy and powerfully built Africans imported from the Ashanti Kingdom. Because slave masters rarely care about diction and pronunciation, Brown changed Kwaku's name, an Akan moniker usually given to people born on Wednesday, into Kook, while Kwamina, which was reserved for men born on Saturday, will become Kumana, a name that means I own you. Therefore, it is my prerogative to erase your history and culture for something that fits neatly into my mouth. But regardless of whitewash nomenclature, the important thing to know is that these two men would inspire a revolt that would change the Louisiana Territory forever. As a major shipping port, New Orleans served as a hub for America's international slave trade, eventually surpassing Charleston as the largest slave market in the United States. Cook and Kumana were among the 50% of captives who made it to the New World without committing suicide or dying along the way. The two arrived to this foreign land in 1806 without any sense of the landscape or its customs. They had no idea that the Louisiana Territory had only been part of America for 3 years, and the federal government was not yet sure when or if it would become a state. They didn't know that France had sold the territory to America after Haiti's slave revolt forced France out of the New World colonization business. They were unaware that the plantations surrounding New Orleans were a veritable mixing pot of African cultures from across the diaspora. Some of the French who escaped the Haitian Revolution had sold their slaves in the territory. Other slaves were imports from various African kingdoms. All Cook and Kwamana knew is that they wanted to be free. There were also things that Brown himself was unaware of when he purchased his new human property. As an import from Kentucky, Brown was not accustomed to the New Orleans territory's demographics, which had so many free people of color that slave patrolling was virtually impossible. Brown had to acclimate himself to the idea that the local traditions dictated that his enslaved humans could visit other plantations and even patronize black-owned bars and meeting houses. Had Brown completed a thorough background check on his human shadow, he might have understood that the scars on Cook and Kwamana meant that they were likely raised as Okofokum, West African soldiers trained in hand-to-hand combat, firearms usage, and war tactics from birth, and he might have guessed that maybe, just maybe, Cook and Kwamana wouldn't be pleased with their circumstances. Brown, who kept a careful eye on his human property, was relieved to see that his new assets had become friends with Charles Deslandes, a Creole mulatto, on Colonel Manuel Andre's nearby agricultural concentration camp. There was no better role model for the two newly arrived Africans than Deslandes. At just 22 years old, Deslandes was the Andre Plantation's primary slave supervisor and was in charge of keeping the other bondsmen in check. He was known to be compliant, intelligent, and so trusted by his master that he was even allowed to exact brutal beating on the men and women he supervised. The other enslaved Africans didn't even seem bothered by his power, or Deslandes' lighter skin, his larger hut, and the other fringe benefits that he enjoyed. Because the torture of slavery was inescapable, who would you rather have wielding the whip? A white man who was part of the society that saw you as subhuman property, or someone who was also subject to the horrors of this inhumane institution? Colonel Andre seemed to trust Deslandes, permitting him to spend the night at his girlfriend's slave quarters on the nearby Trepagnier farm. Trepagnier farm. French, okay. Both slaveholders hoped the romance would result in offspring and the financial windfall of free human labor. A brutal and eccentric master, Francois Trepagnier, was known to keep a small boy, Gustave, as a house pet to whom Trepagnier fed table scraps and treated like a human puppy. But now, Gustave was getting older. Many of Trepagnier's slaves believed the next child born on the estate would replace Gustave as the Trepagnier pet. Unlike Deslandes, Kwamana and Cook didn't ask their master's permission to visit neighboring estates. Late at night, they would employ the techniques gleaned from their homeland's warrior training to abscond temporarily from the Brown farm. As Kwamana crept through the tall sugar canes from plantation to plantation, Cook would post in the tall trees as a lookout. It was there in the forest that they would spend their nights, huddled with Charles Deslandes and Harry Kenner, learning the English language, familiarizing themselves with the cultural terrain, and plotting a rebellion that would change the history of New Orleans. While transcripts of their conversations do not exist, Cook and Kwamana probably recounted tales about being schooled in guerrilla warfare and military strategy, while Deslandes, a mixed race Creole, likely shared stories of rebellion he heard from the thousands of French speaking white immigrants who moved to the Orleans territory after the Haitian Revolution. They unquestionably had to have heard about Juan San Malo, the iconic leader of a nearby Maroon colony. After repelling anyone who dared enter the German coast swamps for years, Malo was finally captured by a Spanish militia in 1784, and he was hanged. And they had to have discussed how even the ideology of freedom was being policed during that time. In 1805, New Orleans governors arrested a white French-speaking man for spreading the ideas of liberty and freedom among free and enslaved people of color. As a former French colony, the Louisiana Territory was teeming with stories about the slaves who had just beat the brakes off of the white slave owners, and white people took notice. But these legendary stories of resistance were not their only impetus for rebellion. In the time between the Haitian Rebellion and the Louisiana Purchase, 3,102 free people of color moved to New Orleans as French citizens. Deslandes and other slaves didn't have to dream about what it would be like to be free. They witnessed people who looked and talked like them, walking around and being treated as whole human beings. Unlike most enslaved communities, the subjugated population of New Orleans had an image of freedom that was not synonymous with whiteness. They saw what was possible, and they were going to take it for themselves, and so they plotted. Their plan was multicultural from its inception. Cook and Kwamana understood that a third-generation slave would not necessarily trust the plans of a warrior who barely spoke the language or a supervisor who carried out the wishes of a white man. Instead, they recruited various leaders, dividing them up according to their country of origin, their language, background, and plantation. Tapping in local leaders to relay the plans and lay out strategies was immensely effective, as they could communicate in the language of the people they recruited. They also would be intimately familiar with the habits of the individual plantations and the obstacles they might face during a violent insurrection. That allowed the leaders to know that some of the recruits were enslaved on the plantations of local militias who were all in Florida fighting the Spanish. Others pointed out that their masters were devout Catholics, which meant on the Feast of the Epiphany, the Christian holiday commemorating three wise men bringing the first gifts to the newborn child who would be revealed as God incarnate, they would be a church. So effectively, insurrectionists had essentially organized individual battalions for an army of rebels. On the night of Tuesday, January 8, 1811, Colonel Manuel Andre was one of the few white men in the area not celebrating Jesus' baby shower. In the middle of the night, he was stirred out of his sleep, wondering why his most loyal slave was standing over him with an axe. As the fog of sleep lifted, Andre noticed that Deslandes was not alone. Just as Deslandes lifted his axe, Andre leaped out of the bed, bum-rushed his accosters, and escaped down the staircase, wounded but alive. As Andre exited his home, he caught a glimpse of the revolters hacking his son Gilbert into pieces. Deslandes did not chase his fleeing masters. Instead, the rebel leader directed 25 fellow revolutionaries from his unit to seize every weapon on the farm. Because both Colonel and Gilbert Andre were leaders of the local militia, there were plenty of muskets to distribute to the trained Africans. The men who were skilled with the blade required for sugarcane farming armed themselves with machetes and swords, while Deslandus rifled through Andrew's closet and found what he was looking for: Andrew's colonial army attire. In a few short minutes, the slave driver had transformed himself into the man he had secretly wished he had been for years. He was now the uniformed military leader of one of America's greatest uprisings. Word of the rebellion quickly spread up the coast. As they marched along the bank of the Mississippi River, 10 more slaves joined the ranks, bringing horses and munitions with them. By the time Deslandus' procession united with Cook and Quamana's even more militant squadron at the Brown Farm, the Black Army numbered well over 100 men. On horseback were 11 leaders representing the diaspora of the enslaved, divided into companies, including the Muslim Senegambian warriors, the Sierra Leone insurgents, the native-born black soldiers, and the African infantry. They began to head toward the Trepagnier forced labor camp. Even as he heard the African war drums approaching, Trepagnier did not fear being taken by the savages. His hands held steady as he leveled his double-barreled musket in their direction. The mist from his gun did not disturb him one bit, even as it intermingled with the smoke from the fire set by the mutineers. Perhaps that is why he did not notice the guerrillas sneaking up from behind the plantation house. By the time Cook began hacking the competent enslaver into chunks, it was too late for fear. But suddenly the African executioner stopped mid-thrust as a small figure approached the scene. Cook stepped aside and watched as Trepagnier's worst fear raised an axe to deliver the death blow. Thus there was no longer a pet. The revolutionaries met at the designated spot and began their march to New Orleans. As they marched toward freedom, the rebellion grew. Because of the driving rain, the brigands couldn't burn down the plantations they passed, but during the march, maroons and free black laborers continued to join in. Although surviving records only account for 24 slaves in the revolt, eyewitnesses say there were between 200 and 500 revolters by the time they were holed up at the Fortier estate, planning to invade New Orleans. The next morning, the sentries at New Orleans awoke to a huddled mass awaiting at the gates. They were the survivors who had somehow escaped the wrath of the multicultural army and fled to the city for safety. Upon hearing that an army of angry black men was marching toward New Orleans, Governor William Claiborne immediately locked down the area. He forbade any male Negro, free or enslaved, from being on the streets after 6 p.m. Knowing that most of his local militia were off fighting the Spanish, Claiborne was desperate to find any way to face down the rebellion. Eventually, the news managed to reach the territory's top military leader, Brigadier General Wade Hampton, who also happened to be one of the largest slave owners in America. Brigadier General Hampton knew he could easily overwhelm the ragtag band of rebels with superior firepower. Only half of the self-emancipated slaves were armed with muskets, and their ammunition was limited. When he discovered that the armed insurgents were at the Fortier place, Hampton ordered an attack, only to find that the coalition had retreated. Little did he know that Ashanti warriors were known for strategic retreats that lured their opponents into a false sense of security. The multicultural brigade was waiting in the nearby swamps, ready to attack. The desperados were all set to wipe the floor with Hampton when suddenly another force attacked them from behind. It was Colonel Manuel Andre. As the uprising's first target, Andre had not fled to New Orleans like the other victims of the insurrection. Instead, he had escaped across the Mississippi and assembled a militia of planters who lived on the other side of the river. The planters gathered every canoe they could find, rowed back across, and stumbled upon the black soldiers. Andre's crew, flush with firepower, simply waited until the slaves ran out of ammunition before they hunted the insurgents down. When they found Charles Deslandes, Andre's vigilante squad chopped off both of his hands, broke both of his legs at the thigh, shot him, and then burned his body on a bed of straw. Deslandes' death was repayment for Gilbert Andre, one of ultimately only 2 white men who died during the entire escapade. Its brutality was meant to serve as a reminder of what happened to a slave who had the audacity to undermine the institution that defined their existence. After a series of interrogations and unsanctioned tribunals, many of the freedom seekers confessed and gave up their conspirators. Quamana refused to name names, but Cook, however, admitted to the revolt's other casualties, proudly boasting that he was the man who had delivered death to the cruel Francois Trepagny. The tribunal decreed that the heads of the executed shall be cut off and placed atop a pole on the spot where all can see the punishment meted out for such crimes, also as a terrible example to all who would disturb the public tranquility in the future. Apparently, enslavement was not a terrible enough example. Governor Claiborne would use the uprising to successfully lobby for statehood, arguing that revolts and extrajudicial executions would continue to happen without federal oversight. The federal government capitulated. On April 30, 1812, the territory of Orleans was admitted to the Union as the state of Louisiana. On July 8, 1815, exactly 4 years after the day the enslaved men along the German coast took up arms against their oppressors, the British Army would attack the American forces commanded by Major General Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. Although the War of 1812 had technically been over for 2 weeks, news of the signing of the Treaty of Jet had not yet reached the United States. For the 3 years prior, the British had won nearly every battle in the war, including the invasion of Washington, D.C. Jackson was woefully unprepared and significantly outnumbered, but he would enjoy the United States' one military advantage. The Brits were attacking a region that was now well equipped for quelling an uprising. When Jackson sounded the alarm for volunteers, over 1,000 well-armed Louisianians grabbed their guns and rushed to his aid. They were better trained than the federal forces and were prepared to fight. It wasn't even a contest. The British suffered about 2,000 casualties, while the United States had around 60. The Battle of New Orleans was the only decisive American victory in the entire War of 1812. Perhaps this is the most enduring legacy of the German Coast Uprising. It was fear. The paranoia during the slave rebellion made plantation owners in the area take their militia duties seriously. Gun sales soared, and volunteer militia continued to train weekly even after the Deslandes, Quamana, and Cook's rebellion had been put down. Everyone was armed and prepared for a slave war that never came. The federal government had even stationed an extra regiment of troops in the area and compensated the slave owners for the executed property. Meanwhile, the city of New Orleans banned the sale of ammunition to black people and outlawed slaves congregating at any event other than a funeral or a Sunday dance. It, it still was New Orleans after all. During the tribunals following the revolt back in 1811, many of the mutineers were asked what would have happened if they had succeeded. Most said they just wanted to form their own all-black town. Like the legendary Juan San Malo, they had planned to build a republic on the German coast and live by the words of the famous French Revolution motto recently co-opted by the state of New Hampshire. Vive libre ou mourir. Live free or die. Even though Brown testified that he watched Quamana, Deslandes, and Kenner plan the rebellion, only Deslandes and one other man were ever fingered as leaders of the multiracial revolt. Deslandes Masters has witnessed his treachery, and of course, he was someone whom white people considered intelligent, so he was an obvious choice. The other man was an enslaved named Jupiter, whom no other enslaved person ever suggested was one of the revolt's principal architects. Perhaps the reason why the jury noted that he was one of the leaders of the uprising was that when the interrogators asked why he joined the insurrection, Jupiter's simple, straightforward answer was recorded in the trial's proceedings and enshrined the source of fear that would forever follow the revolution of 1811. Jupiter said he wanted to go to the city to kill whites. Okay, that's chapter 5. And again, this has a little bit of questions. But again, get the book. Black history is something we need to learn. We need to teach it to our children. And we need to share it with our peers. This is A21. I'll see you in a couple of days.